Oil-stained coveralls hung loose on a 73-year-old frame as Frank Morrison wiped his hands on the same rag he'd been using for the past 15 years. A piece of shop cloth that had once been white, but now carried the patina of decades spent touching metal, oil, and dreams. The small garage on Maple Street wasn't much to look at. 2 bays with concrete floors stained by 30 years of automotive fluids, a hydraulic lift that wheezed and groaned when it moved but somehow never failed, and tools that had seen better decades hanging from pegboards installed when Reagan was president. The morning light filtered through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months, casting long shadows across a workspace that looked like organized chaos to outsiders but represented perfect efficiency to Frank. Every wrench had its place. Every oil can sat exactly where muscle memory expected it to be. And the coffee pot in the corner brewed the same bitter blend that had fueled countless repairs since 1987. To the customers who brought their broken-down Hondas and Toyotas, their aging Buicks and practical Subarus, Frank was just another old mechanic who charged fair prices, finished work when he said he would, and didn't talk much beyond what was necessary to diagnose problems and explain solutions. They saw the gray beard that he trimmed himself every Sunday morning, the permanent grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove, and the way he limped slightly on his left leg. A reminder of an accident in Silverstone that he'd never told anyone about. They assumed he'd been fixing everyday cars his whole life, working his way up from oil changes to engine rebuilds in the slow, steady progression of small-town mechanics everywhere. What they didn't know was that those same hands, now spotted with age and scarred by decades of sharp metal and hot surfaces, had once fine-tuned engines that screamed around Monaco at 200 miles per hour, had personally adjusted the fuel injection systems that carried Ayrton Senna to victory, had designed powertrains that dominated Formula One for over 2 decades and changed the fundamental understanding of what internal combustion engines could achieve when pushed to their absolute limits. The contrast couldn't have been more complete. Frank Morrison, the Formula One engineer, had worked in sterile facilities where a single speck of dust could compromise million-dollar engines, where telemetry data was analyzed by teams of specialists, where every component was weighed to gram and every adjustment measured in thousands of inches. Frank Morrison, the small-town mechanic, worked surrounded by the comfortable clutter of normal repair work, where success was measured in customer satisfaction rather than lap times, where the most sophisticated diagnostic tool was often just listening to how an engine sounded when it was running rough. But both versions of Frank Morrison shared the same fundamental passion: the mechanical poetry of making broken things work again, the satisfaction of understanding how forces and pressures and precisely timed explosions could be harnessed to move the world forward one rotation at a time. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden brilliance and the moment when true expertise reveals itself, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And have you ever met someone who seemed ordinary but possessed extraordinary knowledge? Maybe a teacher, a neighbor, or someone you encountered who turned out to have an amazing hidden past. Share their story with us. If you believe that real masters often work in silence, hit that subscribe button. These stories remind us that genius doesn't always come with a business card. Frank's routine had been the same for 15 years, and he cherished his predictability in a way that would have surprised his younger self. The man who once thrived on the chaos of race weekends, the pressure of championship battles, the adrenaline rush of knowing that millions of dollars in international prestige rode on every decision he made. Now, he arrived at 7 in the morning every day except Sunday, unlocked the garage with a key ring that held only 3 keys, compared to the dozen security cards and electronic fobs he'd carried in his Ferrari days, and started the coffee pot that had been brewing the same bitter blend since the Reagan administration. The morning routine was almost meditative. Check the answer machine for any overnight emergencies. There rarely were any, but Mrs. Henderson occasionally called about her ancient Buick making strange noises. Review the work orders of the day, written in his own careful handwriting on index cards that he filed in a metal box his father had given him 40 years ago. Turn on the radio to the local AM station that played a mix of classic rock and farm reports, keeping the volume just loud enough to provide background noise without drowning out the subtle sounds that engines made when they were trying to tell him what was wrong. Then begin another day of brake jobs, oil changes, transmission flushes, and occasional engine rebuild, Work that looked mundane from the outside but provided exactly the kind of mechanical puzzles that had always calmed his mind and engaged his problem-solving instincts. The difference was that now he solved these puzzles without time pressure, without team principles breathing down his neck, without the constant awareness that every decision would be scrutinized by engineers, journalists, and fans who thought they understood racing better than the people who actually built the cars. He didn't advertise beyond a small sign that had hung beside Route 34 for so long that most locals use it as a landmark rather than thinking of it as a business announcement. Morrison's Garage, honest work, fair prices. No website, no social media presence, no glossy brochures promising expertise with European exotics. Word of mouth in their small Connecticut town was enough to keep him busy, and busy was all he wanted. Not famous, not celebrated, not featured in automotive magazines or invited to industry conferences. Just busy enough to pay the bills, keep his hands occupied with meaningful work, and maintain the quiet life he'd built after walking away from everything that had once defined his identity. The irony wasn't lost on him that his current customers probably trusted him more than his former colleagues ever had. In Formula One, trust was always provisional. Depend on the last race result, the most recent innovation, the current championship standings. Here, trust was earned through consistency, reliability, and the gradual accumulation of properly repaired vehicles that started every morning and got their owners safely to work. Mrs. Patterson's 2003 Honda Civic, which he kept running for 8 years through a series of increasingly creative repairs, represented a greater achievement in some ways than the McLaren MP4-8 that had carried Ayrton Senna to his last championship. The Honda would never appear in motorsport museums or inspire documentaries about engineering excellence, but it transported a retired teacher to her volunteer work at the library 3 times a week, and that mattered in ways that lap records ultimately didn't. The morning everything changed started like any other, with Frank bent over the engine bay of a 2009 Camry that belonged to Tom Rodriguez's daughter, replacing spark plugs that should have been changed 20,000 miles ago. The radio was playing something by Fleetwood Mac. The coffee was reaching that perfect temperature between too hot and too cool, and sunlight was streaming through the open bay door in a way that reminded him why he'd chosen this life over fluorescent-lit garages of Maranello and Woking. He was thinking about lunch, probably a sandwich from the deli across the street, eating at his workbench while reading the local newspaper that still published actual news about town council meetings and high school sports, when a rumble of multiple vehicles pulled into his lot. The sound was wrong for his usual customers, too expensive, too precisely tuned. Frank straightened slowly, setting down his socket wrench with the deliberate movements of someone whose back had learned to protest sudden changes in position. Through the open bay door, he watched as a flatbed truck carefully unloaded what appeared to be a very expensive mistake. The car was a Lamborghini Huracan, its sleek yellow paint job the particular shade that Lamborghini called Giallo Midas, and that Frank recognized from his years of working with exotic manufacturers who understood that visual drama was as important as mechanical performance. But the car's dramatic appearance was marred by steam rising from beneath a crumpled hood, coolant pooled on the truck's flatbed, and the unmistakable signs of catastrophic overheating that Frank could diagnose from 50 feet away. Behind the truck, 2 men in expensive suits climbed out of a Tesla Model S that probably cost more than Frank's annual income. Their faces carried a particular type of stress that comes with very expensive problems. The expression Frank remembered from team principals who just watched million-dollar engines explode in practice sessions, destroying months of development work and potentially compromising entire championship campaigns. The younger of the 2 men may be 40, with the kind of perfect haircut that required monthly maintenance and cost more than most people's car payments, approached the garage with the hesitant steps of someone who was already regretting this decision. His eyes swept over Frank's workspace with barely concealed disdain, taking the mismatched tools accumulated over decades, the oil-stained concrete floor that told stories of thousands of repairs, and the calendar on the wall that was still showing March even though it was now June. Frank kept meaning to change it, but somehow the passage of time felt less urgent here than it had when every second counted toward race weekends. The younger man's gaze lingered on Frank himself, taking the coveralls that had been washed so many times the original blue had faded to something approaching gray, the work boots that had been resoled twice, the general appearance of a man who looked exactly like what he appeared to be, a small-town mechanic who'd probably never worked on anything more exotic than a Corvette. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone suggesting he was already regretting this decision and planning his exit strategy. "We were told you might be able to look at our car. We've already been to 3 other shops, Bavarian Motors in Hartford, European Specialists in New Haven, and that place in Stamford that supposedly handles supercars, and they all said the same thing." Frank wiped his hands on his rag, a gesture so automatic he wasn't even conscious of it anymore, inherited from his father who taught him that clean hands were essential for good work, whether you were adjusting carburetors or fuel injection systems that cost more than houses. What did they say? The second man, older and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms, stepped forward with a confidence that came from decades of making decisions that affected other people's lives and livelihoods. They said the engine is completely destroyed. Some kind of thermal failure in the V10. We were told the entire power plant would need to be replaced, which would cost more than the car's worth. He gestured toward the wounded Lamborghini with a sort of frustrated hand wave that suggested this was not his first expensive mechanical disappointment, and that his faith in both Italian engineering and American diagnostic capabilities was reaching its limits. Frank nodded slowly, his eyes moving to the wounded supercar with the practice assessment of someone who'd spent 5 decades learning to read the language that machines spoke when they were in distress. Even from 20 feet away, he could see the telltale signs of catastrophic overheating. The way the paint around the engine bay had discolored from heat stress, the fact that coolant had pooled beneath the car despite sitting on the truck for what was probably hours, the particular way the hood sat slightly askew that suggested internal components had expanded beyond their normal tolerances. But something about the damage pattern didn't look right to Frank's experienced eye. It was too localized, too specific, too consistent with a particular type of failure he'd seen before in high-performance applications. The pattern suggested a cascade failure initiated by a single point of breakdown, rather than the generalized thermal destruction that the other shops had apparently diagnosed. "Mind if I take a look?" Frank asked, already walking toward the car. The younger man exchanged a glance with his companion, an expression that clearly conveyed skepticism about whether the small-town garage could handle anything more sophisticated than oil changes and brake pad replacements. "Look, no offense, but this isn't exactly a Corolla. This is a $500,000 machine with some very sophisticated engineering. The other shops we went to specialize in European exotics, and they all said the same thing." Frank interrupted gently, running his fingers along the edge of the hood with the practiced touch of someone who'd spent decades reading mechanical stories through fingertips. Sometimes when everyone's saying the same thing, it's because they're all looking at it the same way. There was something in his voice, a quiet confidence that made both men pause. It wasn't arrogance, wasn't the kind of bluster they'd heard from mechanics trying to talk their way into jobs they couldn't handle. It was a tone of someone who had seen this before, who understood that apparent complexity often masked simple solutions when you knew where to look. "What's your diagnostic fee?" the older man asked, his business instincts recognizing something in Frank's demeanor that suggested this might not be a waste of time after all. "Don't charge for looking," Frank replied, already examining the hood release mechanism with the familiarity of someone who'd opened thousands of hoods over 5 decades. "Only charge if I find something worth fixing." The Lamborghinis had opened with particular mechanical precision that separated supercars from ordinary vehicles, and Frank found himself staring down at what should have been a masterpiece of Italian engineering. The V10 engine, normally a work of art that balanced raw power with mechanical beauty, looked like it had been through automotive hell. Coolant lines had burst, leaving green stains across the engine bay. The headers were discolored from heat, and what appeared to be oil had leaked from multiple points. To most observers, it would have looked like a total loss, the kind of catastrophic failure that justified complete engine replacement. But Frank wasn't most observers. He leaned in closer, his eyes following the pattern of damage with the methodical precision of someone reading a story written in metal and fluid. His fingers traced coolant lines, checked connection points, examined the radiator mounting positions with the systematic approach of someone who understood that every mechanical failure told a story about what had happened and why. The two men watched nervously as this old mechanic in coveralls crawled halfway into their $500,000 engine bay, muttering to himself in a way that suggested he was having a conversation with the machinery itself. After 20 minutes of inspection that was far more thorough than anything the previous shops had attempted, Frank straightened up and wiped his hands again. His expression was thoughtful, almost amused, like someone who just solved a puzzle that others had found impossible. "Well," the younger man asked, tension obvious in his voice as he prepared for another expensive diagnosis that would end with recommendations for complete engine replacement. Frank looked at him steadily, his expression carrying the calm confidence of someone who diagnosed far more complex problems under far more pressure. "Your engine's not destroyed." Both men stared at him in disbelief. But the other shop saw catastrophic overheating and assumed the worst, Frank said, walking to his tool cabinet and selecting a specific wrench with the care of a surgeon choosing instruments. But they didn't look at the pattern. This wasn't thermal failure from engine stress. This was thermal failure from system failure. He pointed to a specific area near the front of the engine bay, his finger tracing components that the previous mechanics had apparently overlooked in their rush to deliver expensive diagnoses. "Your auxiliary cooling pump failed. It's a small component, maybe $200 retail, but when it went out, it created a cascade failure in your cooling system. The engine overheated, yes, but it overheated suddenly and briefly. Most of what you're seeing here is cosmetic damage from steam and minor component expansion." The older man frowned, his business experience making him naturally skeptical of solutions that seemed too simple after multiple experts had delivered complex diagnoses. But all that coolant, the oil leaks, blown gaskets from sudden pressure changes, Frank explained, already loosening bolts with movements that were economical and precise, the muscle memory of decades making each action efficient and purposeful. Replace the gaskets, flush the system, install a new auxiliary pump, and you're back to full power. Maybe 1,500 in parts. 2 days of labor. "That's impossible," the younger man said flatly, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd already received authoritative opinions from recognized experts. The other mechanic said the cylinder heads were warped, that the block itself was compromised. They showed us compression readings that proved internal damage. Frank paused in his work and looked up at them, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Not irritation, but kind of patient amusement that suggested he'd had this conversation before, though perhaps in very different circumstances. "They said that because they tested compression while the engine was still hot," he said, his tone carrying the gentle authority of someone explaining basic principles to well-meaning students. "Metal expands when it's heated. Test compression on a hot engine after thermal stress, and you'll get readings that suggest internal damage even when there isn't any. It's a common diagnostic error when you're dealing with high-performance engines that aren't designed to overheat gradually like regular passenger cars." Both men were staring at him now with something approaching suspicion mixed with dawning respect. This wasn't the sort of technical knowledge they expected from a small-town mechanic, and Frank could see the questions forming in their eyes like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. "How long have you been working on cars?" the older man asked, his voice carefully neutral but clearly fishing for information that might explain Frank's apparent expertise. Frank considered the question as he continued working, his hands moving with automatic precision, while his mind calculated how much truth to reveal. The honest answer was complicated. He'd been working on cars since he was 12 years old, when his father had taught him to change oil in their garage in Liverpool. But he'd been working on racing cars for 43 years and designing championship-winning engines for 26 of those years. He'd been specifically working with V10 engines longer than most people had been driving. "Long time," he said instead, offering the kind of non-answer that satisfied curiosity without providing details. As the afternoon shadows grew longer and the Lamborghini's engine settled into quiet confidence of machine functioning exactly as its designers had intended, Frank found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in 15 years. The particular satisfaction that came from sharing his knowledge with people who could truly appreciate its depth and significance. David and Robert weren't just impressed by his technical skills. They were genuinely fascinated by the stories behind those skills, the decades of experience that had shaped his understanding of how high-performance engines worked at their fundamental level. "Tell us about McLaren," David said during a break, while Frank waited for the cooling system to reach operating temperature. "What was it like working there during the Senna era?" Frank leaned against his workbench, considering how much of that history he wanted to revisit. The McLaren years had been the defining period of his career, when everything he'd learned about engine design had crystallized into innovations that changed Formula One forever. But they'd also been years of incredible pressure, when every decision carried the weight of championship aspirations, and where the difference between success and failure was measured in thousands of seconds. "Intense," he said finally. Ayrton was unlike anyone I'd ever worked with. Most drivers, even great ones, they understand their cars intuitively, but they can't translate that understanding into technical language that engineers can use. Ayrton was different. He could feel a problem developing before our telemetry could detect it, and he could explain exactly what the car was doing wrong in terms that helped us fix it. Frank walked to his tool cabinet and retrieved a photograph he'd kept hidden behind the repair manuals for 15 years. It showed him standing next to the McLaren MP44, with Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost flanking the car. All three men were smiling, holding champagne bottles, celebrating another victory in what would become one of the most dominant seasons in Formula One history. This was after Monaco in '88. Frank said, handing the photo to David, "We just clinched the Constructors' Championship with 8 races left in the season. That car won 15 out of 16 races that year. People called it the most perfect Formula One car ever built." Robert studied the photograph with obvious awe. "You designed the engine for this car?" "Led the team that designed it," Frank corrected. "No one person designs a Formula One engine. It takes dozens of engineers, hundreds of technicians, thousands of hours of testing and development. But yes, the fundamental architecture, the combustion chamber design, the fuel injection mapping, that was my work." "What made it so dominant?" Frank smiled, remembering the countless 18-hour days, the wind tunnel sessions that stretched past midnight, the moment when everything finally came together. "We found a way to extract about 40 horsepower more than anyone else from the same displacement and fuel restrictions. Doesn't sound like much, but in Formula One, 40 horsepower might as well be 400. It was the difference between winning and watching someone else win." "How did you do it?" "Better combustion efficiency, more precise fuel delivery, tighter tolerances in the cylinder bores, and one innovation that took us 3 years to develop, a variable intake plenum design that optimized airflow at different RPM ranges." Frank pointed to a specific area of the engine in the photograph. "See that bulge on top of the engine cover? That housed the plenum system. Every other team tried to copy it, but they never understood the software that controlled it." David was studying the photo with the intensity of someone examining a historical artifact, which, Frank realized, it essentially was. "You worked directly with Senna?" "Every race weekend. He'd come to the garage after practice sessions, and we'd go through telemetry data together. He'd describe what the car felt like, and I'd explain what the engine was doing at those moments. It was like having a conversation between the machine and the driver, with me as the translator." Frank paused, remembering conversations that had taken place in paddocks around the world, technical discussions that had shaped championship outcomes. Ayrton understood that the engine wasn't just about horsepower. It was about how that power was delivered, when it was available, how it responded to different throttle inputs. He could feel differences that our instruments could barely measure. "What was your relationship like with him?" "Professional, mostly, but there was mutual respect. He knew I understood what he needed from the car, and I knew he would push whatever I built to its absolute limit. That kind of trust is rare in racing. Usually drivers blame the car when they're not winning, and engineers blame the drivers when their designs don't work. With Ayrton, it was pure collaboration." Robert looked up from the photograph. "Why did you leave McLaren?" Frank had been dreading this question, but he'd known it was coming. The truth was complicated, involving corporate politics. personal burnout, and the gradual realization that success in Formula One required sacrifices he was no longer willing to make. Politics, he said simply. Racing teams are businesses first, and businesses have politics. The more successful you become, the more people want to control your work. Claim credit for your innovations. Make decisions about your projects based on marketing considerations rather than engineering logic. He gestured toward the Lamborghini, now purring quietly with mechanical contentment. Here, when I solve a problem, it stays solved. The customer drives away happy, and that's the end of it. No press conferences explaining why we chose one technical approach over another. No board meetings where accountants question engineering decisions they don't understand. Just good work, done well, for people who need it. But don't you miss the competition? The cutting-edge technology? Frank considered the question seriously. The technology was incredible, he admitted. Working at the absolute edge of what's possible with internal combustion engines, where a 1% improvement in efficiency could determine a world championship. But the competition became about everything except the actual work. Politics, media management, corporate sponsorship deals. The racing almost became secondary to the business of racing. What about Ferrari? Why did you go there? Frank's expression grew more complex. The Ferrari years had been different from McLaren. More passionate, more volatile, more intensely focused on winning at any cost. But they'd also been the years when he'd begun to question whether the game was worth playing at the highest level. Ferrari, he said finally. If you're an engine designer, working for Ferrari is like being a painter and getting invited to work in the Sistine Chapel. It's the ultimate honor, the place where automotive legends are made. But it's also incredibly demanding. Everything revolves around winning, and when you're not winning, everything else falls apart. He walked to the Lamborghini and checked the coolant temperature one final time. Perfect. The repair was complete, the engine was functioning flawlessly, and the customer would drive away with a machine that worked better than it had when it was new. I spent 5 years at Ferrari, Frank continued. Won 3 Constructors' Championships, developed engines that are still considered among the best ever built. But I also worked 90-hour weeks, missed birthdays and holidays, and gradually lost touch with why I'd fallen in love with engines in the first place. What do you mean? Frank leaned against the fender of the Lamborghini, looking out through the open garage door at the quiet street beyond. When I was a kid, I took apart lawnmower engines just to understand how they worked. The magic wasn't in being famous or winning championships. It was in the moment when you figure out how to make something work better than it had before. Somewhere along the way, in all the pressure and politics publicity, I lost track of that magic. And you found it again here? I found something better, Frank said. I found peace. The work is the same whether it's a Formula One car or Mrs. Patterson's Honda Civic. You diagnose the problem, figure out the solution, execute the repair. The satisfaction is identical. David shook his head in amazement. Most people would consider this a step down from designing championship-winning race cars. Frank smiled. Most people measure success by other people's opinions about their importance. I'd rather be important to myself than important to strangers who read about me in magazines. As they prepared for the final test drive, Frank reflected on how strange it felt to discuss his past so openly after years of careful secrecy. But these men had seen his work, understood its quality, and treated it with respect that had nothing to do with fame or reputation. They'd simply recognized expertise when they encountered it, and that recognition felt more valuable than any trophy or award ceremony. David climbed behind the wheel with obvious excitement, while Robert took the passenger seat. They drove off down Maple Street, the Lamborghini's exhaust note fading into the distance, as Frank began cleaning his tools and organizing his workspace. 20 minutes later, they returned, both men grinning with particular joy that comes from experiencing mechanical perfection. The car had performed flawlessly, smooth acceleration, perfect temperature regulation, no hint of the problems that had brought it to Frank's garage that morning. It's better than new, David said, climbing out of the driver's seat. I can't believe how smooth it runs now. What do we owe you? Robert asked, pulling out his checkbook. Frank considered the question. Parts had cost exactly $1,247.83. Labor at his normal rate would add another $800. But this hadn't been normal work, and these weren't normal customers. They'd spent the entire day in his garage, watching him work, asking thoughtful questions, and treating him with respect he hadn't experienced in 15 years. More importantly, they'd given him something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The opportunity to share knowledge he'd accumulated over 5 decades of working with engines, to explain techniques and principles that he developed during his years at the pinnacle of automotive engineering. It had been deeply satisfying to work at full capacity again, to demonstrate the full range of his abilities rather than the deliberately limited skill set he usually displayed. 2,000 should cover it, he said finally. Both men stared at him. 2,000? The other shops quoted us $25,000 minimum for a complete engine replacement. The other shops were wrong. Frank said simply, "This is what it actually costs to fix the problem correctly." Robert wrote the check without hesitation, adding a substantial tip that Frank politely refused. "This has been incredible," he said. "We can't thank you enough. You've saved us a fortune, but more than that, you've given us a masterclass in automotive engineering." As they prepared to leave, David turned back to Frank with a question that had obviously been bothering him. "Can I ask you something? Why didn't you correct the other shops when they misdiagnosed the problem? You could have saved us weeks of frustration and thousands of dollars." Frank was quiet for a moment, watching the Lamborghini warm in the late afternoon sun. "Because they didn't ask me," he said finally. "And because sometimes the best way to help someone is to let them find their way to you rather than chasing after them with advice they're not ready to hear. But you're Frank Morrison. You're a legend in the automotive world. I'm also just a mechanic who happens to know how to fix expensive cars," Frank replied. "The legend part is just history. What matters is the work we do today." As the Lamborghini disappeared down Maple Street for the second time, its exhaust note now carrying the clean satisfaction of perfect combustion, Frank felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced in many years. Not the adrenaline of championship pressure or the validation of professional recognition, but something simpler and perhaps more valuable. The deep contentment that came from work well done, knowledge shared generously, and problem solved completely. The next morning brought changes that Frank hadn't anticipated. He arrived at his garage to find 3 cars waiting in his lot, their owners standing nearby with the patient expressions of people who had heard something interesting and wanted to see if it was true. Word had spread to the local automotive community about what had happened the previous day, and by noon, his phone was ringing every 15 minutes. A local Ferrari owner needed consultation on an unusual vibration that appeared only at highway speeds. A collector with a vintage Porsche 911 was having carburetor issues that 2 other shops couldn't solve. The service manager at the luxury car dealership across town called, asking if Frank would consider taking on some of their more challenging diagnostic work, the kind of problems that stumped their factory-trained technicians and required someone with deeper understanding of automotive engineering principles. Frank handled each request with the same quiet competence he'd always shown, but something fundamental had changed. The secret he'd maintained for 15 years was out, and rather than feeling exposed or pressure to return to his former life, he felt a sense of balance he hadn't experienced in decades. He was still just Frank Morrison the mechanic, content with his simple routine and modest ambitions. But now, when particularly challenging problems arrived at his garage, when other shops gave up and customers needed someone who understood the deeper principles of how high-performance machines actually worked, he was also Frank Morrison the engineer. Not the famous one who appeared in magazines or gave interviews about the future of automotive technology, but the one who simply knew how to fix things that others couldn't diagnose or repair. And in his small garage on Maple Street, surrounded by the familiar tools and oil stains, and a calendar that was still showing March, and probably always would, Frank Morrison had found something that all his years of Formula One success had never given him: the perfect balance between recognition and anonymity, between expertise and humility, between the work he was capable of doing and the life he actually wanted to live. Sometimes legends don't retire to golf courses or consulting contracts. Sometimes they just find quieter places to be legendary, where their knowledge can help people who need it without the complications of fame or the pressures of public expectation. Frank had spent 20 years being a public figure in the world's most glamorous form of motorsport. Now he was spending his later years being exactly who he wanted to be: A man who understood machines, who could fix what others couldn't, and who had chosen wisdom over recognition, peace over prestige, and satisfaction over success. Because real mastery isn't about being seen. It's about seeing clearly and helping others when they need it most, one perfectly executed repair at a time.